All right, in this video we're going to talk about yield curves. Okay, so with an understanding of bond pricing and an understanding of the relationship between bond prices and yields, we can understand what yield curves are. Okay, so I have here on the y-axis bond yields, and on the x-axis the time to maturity. So you can think of these as maybe 1-year government bonds, or 1-year bonds, or bonds with 1 year to maturity, 2-year government bonds, 5-year government bonds, 10-year government bonds, and so on. Okay. Now, given our discussion in class, the idea here is that bond yields will adjust to the likelihood of default, right? And really the only risk that bondholders face is default risk. If they buy a bond and the company or the government stays in business and is able to pay the interest on those bonds, then they don't face any risk. But when the firm or the government faces default, then they're not going to get their money back. Okay, and so our discussion in class, we talked about whether or not there's more default risk in 20-year bonds or in 2-year or 1-year bonds, right? Do bonds with shorter times to maturity face more risk or less risk than bonds with longer time to maturity? Again, the risk we're talking about is default risk. And hopefully you answered that long-term bonds should be more riskier than short-term bonds. The reason is that there's a longer time horizon for problems to arise, right? We don't know what's going to happen in 20 years, and therefore 20-year bonds face greater default risk than, say, 1-year bonds. Okay. So with this being said, what we can do here is we can draw a curve, a hypothetical curve of what we would expect bond yields to look like across different times to maturity, right? So, for instance, 1-year bonds might have yields at about this rate on the y-axis. To the extent that longer-term bonds are more risky than shorter-term bonds, then 2-year bonds and 5-year bonds should have higher yields than 1-year bonds. Likewise, this yield curve should be upward sloping. Okay, and so in a hypothetical world here where bond yields are only concerned about default risk, we should find an upward sloping yield curve. Okay, an upward sloping yield curve is should be what we traditionally find. However, there are times periodically where the yield curve becomes flat. Maybe the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates. And again, the interest rate that the Federal Reserve raises is the Fed funds rate. This is a short-term interest rate. It's on loans, overnight loans. And so maybe the Federal Reserve is putting upward pressure on the short-term side of this yield curve. To the extent that that's true, suddenly you can get a much flatter yield curve. Okay, you can see in this world, yields on 1-year and 2-year bonds are similar, and on 5-year bonds are similar, and on 10-year bonds are even similar. Certainly, we have an upward slope at the end here, but this flattening of this yield curve is not a good prediction of what the economy is going to do. Okay. In rare cases, we have something called an inverted yield curve. In this case, short-term interest rates become so high that they actually exceed the interest rates on, or the yields on longer-term bonds. When the yield curve becomes inverted, this is a bad sign for the economy. Let me show you some data here. Okay, so what we have here in the top panel of this figure, this is the current term spread and GDP growth rates. In green is the term spread, and in orange is GDP growth rates. Now let me explain what the term spread is. This term spread is calculated as the difference in the yields, bond yields, of 10-year government bonds and 2-year government bonds. Okay, so in other words, this is measuring the yield curve. The term spread, the difference in the yield of 10-year bonds and 2-year bonds, should be positive if the yield curve is upward sloping. And you can see here that over time in the 1970s we had an upward sloping yield curve, and suddenly the yield curve flattened, and it even inverted in 1970, almost 1974, and then it reverted and became upward sloping again. Do you see that? So over time, we've had a flattening of these yield curves periodically, and even inversion in this yield curve. We had another one in 1980, another one in 1981. An inverted yield curve. We had flattening that occurred right around the 1990s. We saw here in 2000 the yield curve again inverted, and then we saw a flattening of the yield curve until this time period ends in 2007. By the way, the yield curve did become inverted in 2007, 2006 or 7. Okay, so watch what I'm going to do here. What we've done is we've examined this yield curve, and anytime the term spread becomes negative, this suggests that the yield curve has inverted, and we've plotted also GDP growth. Now, a recession, according to our discussion in class, a recession is defined as 2 consecutive periods of negative GDP growth. And in this top panel, we've plotted the term spread and GDP growth, and we don't really find anything. But what happens if we take this term spread and we move it 1 year earlier? Okay? In other words, let's look at the yield curve, the shape of the yield curve today, and then let's look at GDP growth 1 year from today. Look at what happens. So you can see that the yield curve, remember the yield curve inverted almost in 1974, late 1973. The yield curve inverted in late 1973. And as we look at what happened to GDP growth, it almost tracks GDP growth 1 year later perfectly. Do you see that? In fact, the correlation during this time period is 0.54. Recall that correlation is bound between -1 and 1. So a correlation of 0.54 is a very strong correlation. I'm not sure if there's any other macroeconomic indicator that we can examine that does a better job of predicting the macroeconomy than this term spread or than the inversion of this yield curve. Okay, so these yield curves are super important. Generally speaking, the yield curve is upward sloping. Periodically, it flattens, and in rare cases, it inverts. In the cases that it does invert, that generally spells trouble for the macroeconomy. So let's look and see what's happening to the yield curves now. What I can do is I can hop on the Treasury Department's website here, and they report daily yield curves. And you can see these over time, right? So you have almost all of February 2020 here. Here's 1 month government T-bills, the yields on 1 month government T-bills on 2 month, 3 month, 6 month, and 1 year. And then you have 2-year government bonds, 3-year government bonds, and so on, all the way out to 30-year government bonds. Let's take a look at this and see what the yield curve looks like. In the short run, we have 1 month government bonds. These are called T-bills. We have government T-bills that have a higher yield than 2 month, then 3 month, then 4 month, then 1 year, and then 2 years, and then 5 years. Do you see this? So it looks like the yield curve is inverted in the short run. Particularly if you look at this 1 year government bond and this 5-year government bond, the 1 to the 5 year government bond, we have inversion, right? In fact, it's not until the 7-year and 10-year government bond that the yield curve becomes flat again. Okay, if we were to draw this, it would look something like this. The 1-year government bond, 2-year government bond, right? I'm doing my best to shape this yield curve to plot what it looks like. But you can see that the 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, and even the 7-year government bond is inverted, right? And then the longer term yields on these government bonds, the 10-year, the 20-year, and the 30-year becomes more upward sloping. The 10-2 yield curve, that's probably the yield curve that's looked at the most, is upward sloping, 1.38% to 1.26%. So the 10-2 term spread is positive, but it looks fairly flat. Again, I would keep an eye on these yield curves when you're looking to forecast what the macroeconomy is going to look like.